Good day everyone, we are the group 9 and today we are going to discuss B.F. Skinner's behavioral analysis.
So, good day everyone. I am here to discuss all about Skinner's behavioral analysis, or yung kay Skinner behavioral analysis, they don't focus on the speculations or what we call the intellectual examination, or kumbaga kung ano yung nakikita natin once we saw an individual. Yun na agad siya. Yun na yung buong pagkatao niya. This behavioral analysis mainly focused on the observable behavior, or yung pag-obserba natin or pag-examine natin sa isang individual base sa kung paano siya mag-react or communicate with the world. So, Skinner rejected the notion of free will or the act of voluntariness in corresponds with the behavior. He also emphasized that the environment is the one who influences the behavior. Kumbaga, nagre-react yung isang individual base sa kung anong nasa paligid niya or kung anong nasa environment niya. So, yun yung concept ng behavioral analysis. So, sa biography ni Skinner, si Skinner ay may dalawang brothers. So, siya yung pinakamatanda na. And when he was young, he always wanted to be a writer, and when he got older, he became psychology and he taught at universities of Minnesota and Indiana and go back to Harvard where he died in 1990. So, here, merong dalawang taong I think nag-influensya kay Skinner to do behavioral analysis or nagbigay ng kunting help, and it was Thorndike with his experiments with animals where he stated that the response followed by a satisfier tend to be learned. Kumbaga, natututunan yung, for example, is a dog being called by his owner. So, pag ang dog, tinawag mo ng name niya or kung anong name man yan, and iisipin ng dog na siya yung tinatawag nun. So, the dog tend to wag his tail or go to his owner as a response. So, natututunan niya ng aso, and habang tumatagal ng tumatagal, when the owner always calling the dog, so, the dog keeps on wagging its tail every time the owner calls. So, yun yung kay Thorndike. And another person behind Skinner's concept is Watson. So, Watson argued that psychologists must deal with the control and prediction of the behavior. Because for Watson, behavior is the basic data of scientific psychology. Kung baga dito kay Watson, without behavior, psychology or scientific psychology was nothing. So parang behavior talaga yung pinaka-foundation ng scientific psychology, and without it, we cannot call it scientific psychology, I mean. So, in scientific behaviorism of Skinner, he rejected the existence of thought, emotion, and desires. So, hindi niya dinina yung existence. Hindi niya sinabing hindi nag-i-exist ang thought, hindi nag-i-exist ang emotion, or hindi nag-i-exist ang desire. Sinabi lang niya na hindi yun pwedeng gamitin to explain behavior. And then, dito naman sa philosophy of science. So, Skinner believed that psychologists should first determine the condition why a certain individual behave like this or like that for them to control it and predict the certain individual. So, ang example dito ay different child to different child. So, yung isa is normal child and yung isa is special child. So, pareho natin pwedeng gamitan ng analysis ng same conditioning, but the only problem is hindi tayo makaka-make sure or hindi natin ma-guarantee na pareho yung resulta sa dalawa, because the two individual we use for the experiment have totally different and opposite. So that is why we need to determine the conditions to predict and control them. So may dalawang uri ng conditioning. So i-discuss ko yung isa. So classical conditioning is yun yung may example siyang very common, a boy and a white rat. So parang nilalagyan nila yung ng fear yung lalaki to fear a white rat associated with a loud sound. So parang hindi naman totally takot yung boy sa white rat, pero dahil sa loud sound na sinasabay nila, so matatakot yung boy, or the boy would would have fear on the white rat because of the loud sound. So every time the boy got to see a rat, so parang magugulat siya or matatakot because of the condition feared. At yun yung tinatawag na classical conditioning.
Operant conditioning. This is a type of learning which involves modifying behavior based on consequences. We can see this demonstrated in Skinner's example wherein a rat's behavior was changed because of the consequence of pulling a lever that would be receiving a food pellet as a reward. Knowing that behavior changes according to the consequences of doing an action depending on the stimulus, we can now move on to shaping. So, what is shaping? Shaping is a process wherein successive approximations of a behavior are being reinforced. Using another example from Skinner, we can see shaping took place as a pigeon get rewarded every time it turned left or right regardless of the angle. So over time, the pigeon learned to turn to a certain direction the more it's being rewarded for doing a similar action, be it big or small. Shaping also applies to dogs where we can reward the dogs for moving a certain way as we try to train them. Well, it could be any animal, really. That said, there are conditions in order for operant conditioning to happen. The first one would be the antecedent. It's basically the environment or setting where behavior is being shaped. The second one would be the behavior itself, any action or behavior that we're trying to change or instill. And lastly, the consequence, which should happen immediately after the behavior. Operant discrimination. This is a process wherein an organism learns to respond differently to different stimuli, which basically means not doing the same thing on the condition that the stimulus is not similar to or at least too different from other stimuli. Operant discrimination doesn't happen when a person is saying delicious after tasting ice cream and chocolate. It happens when the stimuli are too different, let's say chocolate and raw chili. In contrast, stimulus generalization refers to responding to stimuli similar to stimuli that are already learned or conditioned in a similar manner. I've already mentioned an example for this, but I'll mention another one. Let's suppose a man is conditioned to laugh at German humor. If he happens to hear British humor, which happen to share some characteristics of German humor, he will probably laugh at it too. They're not exactly the same, but they're not too different either. In a nutshell, an individual or organism will respond similarly to stimuli that have things in common. Behind operant conditioning, we have the process called reinforcement. It is a process of strengthening behavior by providing a consequence. Since consequence, in this case, reward, is essential, we have to realize that strengthening happens because the consequence is desirable. Applying it to academic life, studying will naturally become the strengthened behavior because of the benefits it reaps. In the case, the pleasure of learning relevant skills. It has two effects. First would be strengthening behavior. In other words, building a habit. And the second one would be rewarding the person. What makes this so effective is that with strengthening, behavior becomes automatic. We don't have to think what to do if we instinctively know what must be done according to the stimulus. There are two types of reinforcement. The first one would be positive reinforcement, and it involves adding a desirable consequence. And the second one would be negative reinforcement, and it involves removing an adversive consequence or stimulus. Both strengthen behavior, the difference being that the one involves adding something good and the other involves removing something bad in the conditioning process. While operant conditioning is the main thing Skinner was focusing on, he had something to say about punishment. Punishment isn't something Skinner would encourage to employ. He believed that punishment only eliminates bad behavior and it doesn't cultivate good behavior. Here, punishment refers to the process wherein the frequency of behavior is being reduced by adding an aversive consequence. It has three effects: suppress behavior, condition a negative feeling, and spread its effects. By condition a negative feeling, I mean punishment cultivates grudge or resentment in the individual or organism being punished. While punishment may suppress behavior, it doesn't eliminate the negative attitude to someone or something. By spread its effects, I mean punishment causes the punished to influence others negatively. For example, punishing a kid for making a simple mathematical mistake might make the kid resentful and therefore spreading the attitude to other people, influencing their attitude. There are two types of punishment. The first one involves presenting an aversive stimulus, and the second involves removing a positive reinforcer, something that reinforces behavior. The former introduces the undesirable, and the latter removes the desirable. And so, overall, both reinforcement and punishment are polar opposites and therefore should be employed sparingly. But B.F. Skinner suggests that we should rather use reinforcement more often.
Thank you for that, Mr. Von Gabay. Next, we have conditioned and generalized reinforcers. A while ago, my groupmate talked about reinforcers. An example of this is food. It is a reinforcement because it removes the condition of deprivation. When a person is food deprived, he will need to have food, and the food being the reinforcer and it being directly connected to the condition of deprivation makes it a primary reinforcer. Now, when we talk about money, it can also satisfy our deprivation, but not directly, right? If we're food deprived, we need money to get food. And the money being associated with the primary reinforcer, which is the food, makes the money a conditioned reinforcer. And the money being used to get more than one primary reinforcer, such as water or shelter, makes it a generalized reinforcer. In a nutshell, when we say conditioned reinforcer, it means that it is associated with the primary reinforcer, and it can be used to get that primary reinforcer, while a generalized reinforcer means that it can be associated with more than one primary reinforcer, like the money, which can be used to get different primary reinforcers, like I've mentioned earlier. Next, we have schedules of reinforcement. Dito, there are two. The first one is continuous schedule and the second one is intermittent schedule. When we say continuous schedule, it is where there's a reinforcement for every response. Like laging merong reinforcement for every response. For instance, there's a pigeon and tinitrain mo siya. Tuwing gagawin niya yung desirable behavior, there is a reinforcement like a food pellet. And dito naman sa intermittent schedule, there's no reinforcement every time the behavior is made. Meron lang siyang sinusunod na parang schedule or pattern. Okay, under the intermittent schedule, meron siyang apat. Ang una ay fixed ratio schedule. The organism is reinforced after every end response. Let's say, for instance, nga, yung pigeon na binibigyan ng food pellet. Kasi di ba pag continuous schedule, laging may reinforcers. For example, sa 5 to 1, 5 beses na ginawa ng pigeon yung desirable behavior, 5 beses din siyang makakatanggap ng reinforcer na food pellet. Pero, dun yun sa continuous schedule. Pero dito sa fixed ratio schedule, meron siyang ratio. Kung 5 to 1, eh di nakalimang gawa ng desirable behavior yung pigeon, dun lang sa panglimang behavior na yon na nagawa niya, dun lang siya makakatanggap ng food pellet. So, dito sa fixed ratio schedule, if the ratio is 5 to 1, Yun nga, after the fifth behavior, saka siya makakatanggap ng isang reinforcer. That is fixed ratio schedule. May ratio lang. Next is a variable ratio schedule. The organism is reinforced after the end response on the average. Kung dun sa una, may fixed number kung saan after every occurrence ng behavior, bibigyan siya consistently ng reinforcer, dito sa variable ratio ay flexible. Hindi siya consistent dun sa after every end response. Example nito ay yung slot machines na nilalaro ng mga tao. May nakaset na variable ratio schedule kung kailan magpe-pay off yung machine. But rather than it being fixed, it is flexible. If ngayon, after ng pang-10 na hulog ng coin, may nakuha na laruan, yung player, then yung next na makakakuha siya ng laruan or the reinforcement ay after pa ng pang-15 nakuha naman, and so on. This kind of schedule results in high, steady rates of responding. The organisms are persistent in responding because of the hope that the next response might be the one needed to receive the reinforcement. After that, we have fixed interval schedule. The organism is reinforced for the first response following a designated period of time. Example nito ay employees that are paid every 2 weeks. Binibigyan sila ng reinforcer, which is the money, every 2 weeks. Yung 2 weeks yung period of time. Regardless of how many desirable behaviors yung nagawa nila for that period of time, they will still get the reinforcer or the money. Kahit na hindi nila magawa yung desirable behavior or not. And next is a variable interval schedule. It simply provides reinforcement after random time intervals, regardless of how much effort was exerted. Now, ano ang kaibahan nito dun sa naunang fixed interval schedule? Doon sa fixed interval schedule ay fixed na doon every 2 weeks. Nakakatanggap sila ng reinforcement or susweldo sila. Pero dito sa variable interval ay random time. Random time lang kung kailan sila makakatanggap ng sweldo, parang ganun. Kaya hindi ito common ginagamit kasi kapag random time interval ang dating ng reinforcement ay hindi ganun ka-motivated mag-exert ng effort ng mga tao. Kasi 'di ba kadalasan mamomotivate tayong gumawa kung alam natin na meron agad sureball na reinforcement kang matatanggap. Next is extinction. Alam naman natin ng extinction ay ang pagkawala. Under ng extinction is something we called operant extinction or extinct. Nawawala na yung learned response because yung reinforcer ay hindi na binibigay. Operant extinction. That's it. Next is the control of human behavior. We have 2. First is social control, followed by self-control. Under ng social control, there are 4. The first one is operant conditioning. The society exercises control over its members through the 4 principal methods of operant conditioning. As you can see, there is a table. Meron tayong 4 na principal methods of operant conditioning. Una ay positive reinforcement. It is a process that strengthens the likelihood of a particular response by adding a stimulus after the behavior is performed. Example, a student will get a new phone if she got 90 as her average sa kanyang academics. So, yung phone, yung ginamit to increase the likelihood of getting a high grade. Next is yung negative reinforcement. Something is removed to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Ang example ng negative reinforcement where you remove something to increase the likelihood of a behavior is yung alarm clock. Diba pag tulog ka, magigising ka sa beep nung alarm clock mo. So, para magising ka, to increase the likelihood of the behavior na magigising ka, na babangon ka sa bed mo, you will remove that beeping sound, which means napapatayin mo yung alarm clock. So, that is a negative reinforcement. That's an example of negative reinforcement. Now, let's move on to the punishment. Meron ding positive punishment at negative punishment. Sa positive punishment, may dinadagdag, something is added to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. An example of a positive punishment is scolding a student to get the student to stop texting in class. So, yung inad doon para hindi na mag-text yung bata during the class is yung scolding or pinagalitan siya ng teacher. Something is added to decrease yung behavior niya na pag-text during the class. Next is negative punishment. Dito naman may tinatanggal to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Example, kapag yung bata ay nagmi-misbehave, a parent can take away her favorite toy. In that case, ang stimulus ay yung toy at tatanggalin siya bilang parusa or punishment tuwing nagmi-misbehave yung bata para mag-behave na siya. Ang next social control is describing the contingencies of reinforcement. It involves language or usually verbal. In this type of social control, you describe what's about to happen or the consequences in the future in order to prevent someone from doing a certain behavior. For instance, a parent, in order to prevent their child or their son from slacking off and having failing grades, you'll tell him that if he fails today in school, he'll not find a good job and he'll suffer for the rest of his life from poverty. That is a type of social control that happens a lot in everyday lives. Yung parang pagbabantaan mo siya, ganun, i-describe mo yung contingencies as a social control. Next, depriving or satiating a person. Even though deprivation and satiation are internal states, the control originates with the environment. People deprived of food are more likely to eat. Those satiated are less likely to eat even when delicious food is available. Kapag kulang sa food, your behavior will be looking for food. Kapag busog ka naman, kahit na meron na dyan, you wouldn't eat pa rin. So that is depriving or satiating a person. Ang last social control ay physically restraining an individual. People can be controlled through physical restraints. This type of social control is literally makakontrol ka kasi physically restrained ka na. Kaya, type siya ng social control. Next, self-control. People can also control their own behavior through self-control, but control ultimately rests within the environment and not free will. It says na wala daw talaga tayong free will. It is actually the environment that dictates us kung anong gagawin and yung ginagawa natin. And yun ang ginagawa natin. For example, a student wanting to concentrate on his study can turn off a distracting television set. And a woman can set an alarm clock so that the aversive sound can be stopped only by getting out of the bed to shut off the alarm. Sa mga example na yun, the substitute behaviors are negatively reinforcing because they allow a person to avoid unpleasant behaviors or thoughts. Next is unhealthy personality. The aforementioned techniques of social control and self-control produce detrimental effects which results in inappropriate behavior and unhealthy personality development. So basically, kapag nasobrahan tayo dun sa social control, nakaka-apekto yan sa pagkakaroon ng ating unhealthy personality. And with that being said, para takasan ang social control na nagka-create ng unhealthy personality, gagamit tayo ng counteracting strategies. Merong 3 types ng counteracting strategies. We can escape, we can revolt, or we can use passive resistance. So, dito sa escape, pwede nating takasan yung social control sa simpleng pagtakas talaga. Tayo na mismo yung lalayo dun sa taong nag-i-impose sa atin ng social control lalayaan natin sila either physically or psychologically. For instance, if you're someone in your family or someone is trying to control you gamit yung mga una nating nabanggit, edi lalayaan mo na sila. That is escape. Next is revolt. People who revolt against society's control, behave more actively, counteracting the control agent. Example nito, yung mga taong nagre-rebelde. People can rebel through vandalizing public property, or yung mga estudyante na nagre-rebelde sa teacher. Kasi diba yung teacher is kinokontrol din niya tayo when we're inside the classroom. Sila yung authority, sila yung magsasabi kung kailan tatahimik, or ano ba yung dapat gawin, or kagaya nga sa punishment kanina na kukunin yung phone kapag nagte-text ka inside the classroom. Pagtatakasan mo yung social control na yun at ginamit mo tong number 2 na revolt or magre-rebel ka, edi siguro magwawalang hiya ka or magiging pasaway ka doon sa teacher. And magre-rebelde ka laban doon sa teachers, lalo kang magkukulit. Kasi gusto mo nga i-counter attack yung controlling agent. Isa pang example nito ay yung ino-overthrow nila yung mga tao sa government kasi gusto nga nilang labanan yung social control. Next is passive resistance. People who counteract control through passive resistance are more subtle than those who rebel and more irritating to the controllers than those who rely on escape. Example nito ay stubbornness. For instance, if a child with homework doesn't want to do his homework, ang gagawin niya, maghahanap siya ng excuses on why he cannot finish his homework. Tinawag siyang passive resistance kasi malalabanan mo yung social control in a passive way. Hindi siya ganun kaingay or kagulo, hindi kagaya na nauna na escape and revolt, na may papakita mo talaga that you are against the person who's in control or the social control. So, ang number 3 ay passive resistance. Subtle lang yung pag-resist mo dun sa social control. Okay, next. Sa behavioral analysis, according to our book, although the internal states such as thinking and feeling exist, they cannot be used as explanations of behavior. Only overt behavior can be studied by the scientist. And people can also control their own behavior through self-control, but all control ultimately rests with the environment and not the free will. That ends our report for behavioral analysis, and thank you for listening.